Well, thank you everyone for being here. I am joined today by Dan Jones, the author of many incredible historical books, from the Templars to the Plantagenets and now to Henry V. So thank you so much for being here today and for joining us on Poured Over to talk about this lovely man.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I have to have us start by talking a little bit about Henry, setting him up. Some people may not know very much about him. He may not be the most famous Henry in the kings of England, especially among some of our more famous counterparts. But could you set up Henry, his reign, and a little bit of why we should know him?
Of course, yeah. So Henry V, to locate it in time, we're in the later Middle Ages, early 15th century. He rules between 1413 and 1422. So that's a very short reign for his dynasty, which is the Plantagenet dynasty. In fact, of the crowned Plantagenet kings, only Richard III reigns for a shorter time. But Henry V's reputation in his own day, thereafter, really up until the later part of the 20th century, was as the greatest of the medieval kings. And by that I mean the guy who did the job perfectly. 50% of the job was warlord. Well, he's an English king who conquered France and effectively took the French crown. At home, he was known as a lawgiver, somebody who sorted out decades of drift and poisonous factional politics. So he really got both sides of the job done very well. He's known for having a preposterous pudding bowl haircut, for having a portrait painted in profile, which some people think is because he had a big scar down one side of his face, which may or may not be true. So he's the medieval king who did it all. He's not the guy with 6 wives. That's a different subject altogether.
Yes, and if there's any French listeners or French people, we're sorry if there are still any hard feelings about this time.
For some of us, the 100 Years' War is not necessarily over. That's what I'll say.
The 100 years plus
Yes,
war.
yeah, the hundreds of years' war, we call it.
And that's okay. We all have our battles. So you've written about the Plantagenets quite a bit. This is something that you've talked about on your podcast as well. This is something that interests you clearly very much. But we need to talk about Henry getting his own book. Right.
So the second book that so this is my 15th book. Again, you're welcome to clap if you want. But no, please don't. Yeah, thanks. So my second book was called The Plantagenets, and that was a dynastic history of the Plantagenet family, which began with Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine in the 1150s. And that book finished in 1399 with the deposition of Richard II, who is the king when Henry V is a young boy. The sort of sequel book to that, known in the US as The Wars of the Roses, elsewhere in the world as The Hollow Crown, took up the story in 1420 with the marriage of Henry V to Catherine de Valois, who would, one way or the other, be the kind of founding matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. So those books operated kind of as a pair, and if you read them, you had almost a complete dynastic history of the Plantagenets. But there was a Henry V-shaped gap in between them. And I left that gap partly for reasons I've just described, the kind of internal structures of the other two books, but also because Henry V, as I've said, was considered the greatest of the medieval kings. And it seemed to me that it would be interesting one day to write a book devoted just to him. Partly because his story is extraordinary, and partly because, and I think this is a reason to write the book now, it's a great case study in leadership in a time of crisis. So Henry is a guy who comes to the throne after you've had a king in Richard II who is narcissistic, solipsistic, paranoid, vicious, petty, incredibly vain, interested mostly in his own sort of deeds, achievements, and he's not a very good monarch. But then you have then you have Henry IV, who is his glory days somewhere receding in the distance, who's then incredibly sort of decrepit and is sort of bowed under the weight of the office he has to carry. And so these are the two sort of poles of leadership under which Henry V grows up. And it produces a very poisonous, faction-ridden, post-pandemic, miserable sort of society, right? So, but then one leader comes along, and it seems, it seems, by virtue of sheer charisma, force of personality, and will and determination to succeed, seems to sort it all out by taking the best of those two candidates, as it were. The sort of theatricality, the showmanship, the magnificence of the first, and the dogged kind of managerialism of the second, fuses it together, and you have this kind of almost perfect leader, or so it seems. So a study on its own of this particular leader is, yes, an exciting medieval story, but it's also a kind of, I wouldn't say a parable or an analogy for the present times, but a story germane to the world we're living in 2024.
So many of the best historical works, these narrative nonfictions, I think they come from moments of crisis, moments of pivot, of change, and that certainly describes much of Henry's entire life. He's found time and time again, whether he's watching as a child or experiencing and influencing firsthand as an adult, he is watching these moments of pivot. And that goes into telling such a great story. And I think it helps us really get a sense of how quickly changing the world around him was.
Yeah, this is this time at the end of the 14th century into the beginning of the 15th century is a time of rapid change, and there are changes in people's general attitudes towards the world. I mean, their sort of changing values is at the very beginnings of what becomes known as the Reformation. You know, it's Lollardy, it's new ideas about how the world's organised, about how religion should be shaped. That dominates, Henry's younger years. There is this, of course, this is revolution of 1399, during which he's a teenager, where his father deposes Richard II, the reigning king. So he sees a whole sort of, a full revolution in government. There are these lingering effects of the Black Death, the worst pandemic in human history. So this is a time of flux, a time of change, and he is, as almost all historical figures are, a product of those times. They forge him and they shape him, and I think, as you said, Jenna, that is true of most figures from most ages of history. You're a product of interaction between your times and your personality.
And it gives us sort of a challenge to portray someone this far back in history. We're working on a different kind of sources than we would be if we're talking about someone now. And I think a lot of that is very interesting on the way that you chose to narrate this book in present tense versus a past tense, or, it gives us a different momentum. It gives us a different perspective. I wonder if you just talk a little bit about that choice and how it felt to write in that way.
Well, yeah, so this is the first biography that I've written, and I thought long and hard about the way to approach the task, because in some senses, a medieval biography is like a contradiction in terms. Certainly if we mean biography in the way that we typically do when we think about modern biographies, which often will draw on thousands of pages of sources which give us a direct insight into the subject's evolving psychology, and it's a study in personality and character in so many ways, as well as a life and times. You don't have those kind of sources for medieval subjects. I mean, pretty much full stop. Maybe arguably someone like William Marshall at the beginning of the Plantagenet period, but not for Henry. You have a relatively small number of documents which give any kind of introspective insight. The challenge of writing a biography then is, like, how do you create in a work of narrative nonfiction a sense of closeness between reader and subject? And how do I, the biographer, disappear as far as possible? Because one of the things I think I've increasingly tried to do in my non-fiction work over the years is to develop styles of writing where you're just kind of, you the writer aren't there. You're not sort of doing your kind of tricks and funny dances to impress the reader. You're just letting the material come to the reader. So it would seem, having said all that it would be a strange decision to write a historical biography in the present tense, because it sounds very experimental. But my reasoning was, well, when I make my podcast, when I narrate television shows, we almost always do that in the present tense, by which I mean, let's give an example from this book. It's 1415, Henry has amassed a great armada in the Solent outside Portsmouth and Southampton. He takes it to Harfleur on the coast of Normandy, and there they disembark. Okay, that would be a normal way to narrate in speech. And as I was thinking about developing this book, I was thinking about the first chapter when he's a young child and he's having new clothes bought for him in the summer and the winter, and candle wax so he can read at night, and harp strings as he learns to play new musical instruments, and books, always books, this house, this incredibly literate house he lives in. And I found I'm narrating that in the present tense, and I found it was giving me a sort of sense of closeness to this character that was like one notch on from the traditional past historical style of narrative. I thought, well, actually, maybe the idea of writing the whole book in present tense is not insane, given all the reasons I've just explained. However, I was careful not to tell anybody I was doing that, because they would have, I can see my editor Teresa at the back smiling with relief that, I think maybe it's relief. I did not really tell anyone I was doing that, because I thought they would all tell me not to do it. And I just wanted to, I believed this was the right way to do this book, and I believe that it's been I think it's been the right way to write a medieval biography, and I don't know that I'll ever do it again, but it's certainly right for this book.
They can't tell you can't do it if you've already written the whole book.
No, they can. They actually can, and that's like a real problem for me.
Yeah, but they didn't. It's fine. It's great.
And I hope that's testament to the style work.
It is. I think especially when you are reading about someone who is so far in the past, I think many people don't have, especially in the US, I would say many people do not have a great frame of reference for this time period. There's so many misconceptions about the medieval period, the Dark Ages. There's a lot of misconstrued or just lack of knowledge, and so I think being able to really get inside of it and feel like you're right among the action, it really helps to sort of put you exactly where you need to be.
Right, and I think that's something that speaks to the job of the historian, whatever age you're writing in, that your subjects never knew that they were in the past, if that makes any sense. And part of the job of the historian, certainly the sort of narrative non-fiction historian, as I am, is to create what I call empathy bridges across time, so that it's not like saying, hey, these people were just like us, they walked like us, they talked like us, because often they didn't walk like us or talk like us. They were profoundly different, but there is you find some connective means of bringing your reader into that world so that they can understand the characters on their own terms. And that is the job, whether it's the Middle Ages or any other time. I mean, you're right about misconceptions to do with the Middle Ages. Game of Thrones has been absolutely brilliant for medieval historians. It has also sort of, given us a vision of the Middle Ages that is just, take out the sci-fi aspects, the dragons and such, that is just like relentlessly grim. And you could argue that a history of the 20th century told in a particular way would be relentlessly grim. 20th century was probably the most barbaric and hideous century in human history, but we don't tend to think of it like that because it's closer to the modern age. All that being said, I don't get too worked up about misconceptions about the Middle Ages, because at least there are some conceptions. I mean, what I'm always looking for with books, or what I'm usually looking for with book subjects, and what I've found over the years have been the most kind of commercially successful books, although that's not the only metric, it's an important one, are subjects that people have heard of. So I wrote a book about the Templars, and I remember then that people were like, I know I've heard of the Templars, I'd like to know more. The Plantagenets to a degree. I hope Henry V, people are like, okay, what, Agincourt, Shakespeare guy, pudding bowl haircut, profile, something at least. And the same goes for the whole period. The Middle Ages, medieval, and even if it's like Game of Thrones? Yeah, like Game of Thrones, but let me tell you more about it. Let me tell you how it really was. History can be a hard sell, because it's not always, but it can be a hard sell. So it's great when you have a topic that people like, at least have got some sense of it.
Something that I found very interesting that I don't always know that I track or think about when I'm reading history from this time period, and you mentioned it several times and I appreciated, was mentioning what languages people were speaking at the time. Whether they were speaking French, whether they were speaking English, things in Latin. I think that it's really interesting to go back and think that it was England, but we weren't always speaking English at that time.
Yeah, that's true, and this is at least a trilingual world at the top of politics. So in the later Middle Ages, so it's the sort of broad period. So we're going from like the 11th century through the 15th. You have just in England, you have three basic languages going on at once. You have Latin, the language of the church, of international diplomacy. You have English, the language of the peasantry, the ordinary folk, and then you have French, the kind of courtly language. What's interesting about Henry V's time is that things are somewhat changing. So yes, Latin will continue to be a sort of high language of high diplomacy and of the church, certainly the Catholic Church, for centuries to come. French will remain a sort of an international lingua franca, but English is having its sort of moment. And that begins when Henry V is a child at the end of the 14th century. When he's a child, writers like Geoffrey Chaucer, author of the Canterbury Tales, are being cultivated, patronised. They're around the court of Richard II. They're writing for people like Henry's grandfather, John of Gaunt. Chaucer is, just as Shakespeare would do in the 16th into early 17th century, reinventing or English. I mean, remixing English is probably a better term. Drawing in all of these new influences, these new words, these new ways of writing and expressing ideas and stories in English. So it's becoming, English at this point is becoming a language of poetry, to a degree a courtly language. Henry makes it a language in part of diplomacy, but more of propaganda. So when Henry V is on his famous French campaigns, Harfleur, Agincourt, the ones famous from the Shakespeare play, and then later the rolling conquest through Normandy and then tracking towards Paris, he's writing letters home, a lot of the time to the citizens of London who've lent him money for the campaign. He's been pawning like his crowns, his jewels, even the pots and pans from the royal kitchens, and he's writing back to the people who've lent him the money for the campaign in English. And that's important in his terms because writing English when he's got lots of Englishmen fighting for him in France, and they've got the Cross of St. George everywhere, and their sort of band of like soccer hooligans basically, is important. And he's looking always for ways to bind them and with the quote-unquote nation back home. In terms of writing a biography, a life of Henry, it's important because you get his words almost unmediated. His letters are probably dictated in the main to a scribe, but you hear his voice, and that's really rare for a medieval king. And Henry's got a really distinctive voice as well. He's impatient. We're used to Shakespeare's voice of Henry. Once more into the breach, dear friends, and we few, we happy few, we band of brothers, and all of that from Shakespeare. Well, Henry, the real Henry, is much more kind of terse, direct, imperative than that. He's always like, see that ye fail not thereof, which sounds kind of wordy to us today, but is like, get it done, don't mess it up. And then there are lots of, the most famous one, my favourite one from the book is there are lots of accounts of what the real Henry says before the Battle of Agincourt. Does it bear any reflection to Shakespeare's kind of soaring prose? Well, one account says that he doesn't give a great florid speech before Agincourt at all. He just says, fellas, let's go. And so I love that sort of stuff.
I do too. I'm incorporating that into my daily speech to myself in the mirror when I'm like trying to get going in the morning or before things. It helps.
Fellas, let's go.
Yeah. Fellas, parentheses, gender neutral, let's go. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. A signed copy of the book to the first person in the room that gets it tattooed.
I think that bringing up Shakespeare is very interesting, and it kind of goes into something that, from the questions that I have here and from my own sort of wonderings, we often look back on historical figures through our own lenses or through the lenses of whatever time that we are operating in. So Shakespeare had his version of Henry and his compatriots. We now look back, on some of the things he's done and may say like, oh, I can't believe that a leader would, or, as we go through. But you work very hard, and I think very successfully, at painting a picture that is to say, this is who he was, this is what was expected of him at the time. We can't bring necessarily our judgments into that. Like you just said, that some people would say our modern age is one of the most brutal and violent ages, but I think a lot of people looking back would read some of the things that happen in this book with a bit of pause.
Absolutely, of course. And, some of the criticisms that more recent historians have levelled against Henry V include charges of brutality, coldness, callousness, and misogyny, to which the obvious retort is, have you met the Middle Ages? One of the key charges against Henry, which is also depicted in Shakespeare, is at a critical point at the Battle of Agincourt, where the English, outnumbered, depleted, exhausted, diseased, had seen off a much larger, better equipped, better fed, less tired French army. It appeared that French reinforcements were coming back to the battlefield, so Henry gives this notorious order to kill the prisoners that the English have taken, and sends around a sort of hit squad to make sure that's done. It's often charged that this is sort of against the rules of war, the rules of chivalry. And, well, first, you can quibble with that and say the French had taken the Oriflamme, kill them all, no quarter given. No chronicler at the time blames Henry for... No French chronicler at the time blames Henry for doing this. It's all on the idiots who made it look like they were coming back to the battlefield. So I kind of lay out those arguments. And to be clear, I'm not pro-mass slaughter. And that, I hope, should be clear. But you raise a more general point which pertains to the practice of history in the early 21st century per se. And we're at an odd point for historical writing just generally. We're at an odd point for like values and judginess in general. It's my opinion that when you write history, you should, as far as possible, see and explain and seek to understand the people you're writing about in their own terms. Not doing that is problematic. But we're at a moment where there has been this sort of irresistible urge on the part of the historian to become the policeman, to sort of wander around history with their sort of wagging finger and say, bad history, bad other people, you don't conform precisely to the norms, mores, pieties and preferences of the 21st century, which, may I just say as an aside, is probably the weirdest time ever in the whole of human history. It's just that we happen to live in it and sort of our norms seem perfectly fine to us. And it doesn't necessarily produce very good history. You're free to do it if you want to. I myself think it's not a very good idea. So in a book like Henry V, what I've tried to do is take Henry on his own terms. And when ascribing like value judgments to his actions, say, what do people say at the time? What do they think at the time? This is their world, not our world. Our values are not the same as theirs. And if they came a judging in the 21st century, they would find us, decadent, disgusting, depraved, heretical, mystifying, and magical, and would be highly displeased with the way we conduct ourselves. But, that's not what history is about. It's not about going wagging your finger. It's about trying to understand people on their own terms.
I think if someone wrote a history book about me, I would not be probably very flattered with what they would come up with. I don't know. I don't know.
You don't know that.
Well, that's true, I suppose. But I think that in general, trying to
What if they judged you on your own terms and the standards of the time?
Correct.
You're sort of fessing up to being a bad citizen.
Oh, no. It's okay. I think in general, the way that we look at things... I guess also if Henry V was looking at my life, he would have questions and concerns, I'm sure.
I don't want to comment on your
That's
on
fair.
your life.
I don't need the comments. I don't need the comments.
But your general point of that there would be a sense of sort of mutual... It's Wittgenstein, isn't it? If the lion could speak, yes. We still wouldn't understand it.
Yes. And I think that, in general as well, something that comes up with figures like Henry, and in general, historical figures is in these times where we're dealing with varying kinds of accounts, and often who gets to tell our story, and what is the sort of bias or perspective of those individuals, especially if they're talking generations later. And also how often people, and Henry included, get boiled down to one or two aspects of their personality. Is Henry the brutish warlord? Is he the pious, religious king who is visiting sacred places? Is he, the partier from Shakespeare who gets turned around? All of these things might seem like a big aspect of a personality, but when you add them all together, they create a much different picture.
Yes, and biography is about sort of shades and subtlety and often contradictions, and that's when you're trying to recreate a human life, it's it almost vanishingly few are the people who are and extremely boring, I would say, are the people who are not sort of contradictory and difficult and at times inexplicable and at times likable and at times unlikable. That's what being a human being is all about, and the craft, even the art of biography, is to somehow lay that out on the page in a way that's both compelling to a reader and is sort of sensitive to what that your subject was actually like.
I think a big part of that in this is not only just the descriptions of Henry himself, but of those people around him at the time and the world that he was sort of interacting in. We were talking a little bit before about one of my favorite characters, as you could say, from this book, which is Oldcastle himself, a rival, a nemesis, could you even say, of Henry's?
Well, John Oldcastle is an important character in Henry V's story. Oldcastle's in some ways the model for Falstaff and Shakespeare. A good friend of Henry, insofar as Henry had many good friends. He only had, but he did, as prince, he had a tight circle of allies and friends on whom he relied. And Sir John Oldcastle, Lord Cobham, was one of them. So when Henry was Prince of Wales and he was regent for his, decrepit and ill father, Henry IV, and was effectively running the government and the foreign policy of England, he sent a group of his most trusted sort of henchmen, allies, the Earls of Arundel and Warwick, and Sir John Oldcastle, over to France to intervene in the French Civil War that was going on there between the Burgundian and Armagnac factions. And they intervened on the Burgundian side quite effectively. And Oldcastle was chosen for this job because he was close to Henry. But Oldcastle was also, by the definition of the day, a heretic. He was a Lollard. He was a member of this proto-Protestant sect that followed the teachings of the radical Oxford theologian John Wycliffe, or Wycliffe if you prefer. And he was adamant and unrepentant and incorrigible in his heresy. He wouldn't back down. He refused, he was blatantly and openly buying books which were banned by the church at that time, and when confronted with it, he made a literally fatal error. He tried to fall back on his friendship with Henry, who had just at that point become king. That was his big mistake, and that was his sort of fatal blindness and misunderstanding of the guy he thought was, a friend. Henry had become king. And for Henry, that meant something. The bit that Shakespeare really gets right about Henry V is that there is a form of transformation when he becomes king, where he's never the playboy, roustabout, roistering, drinking, womanizing Prince Hal of Shakespeare. That's confection. But there is a transformation he makes from being a prince to a king, where he realizes he's rising up one notch, and an impartiality, a sense of probity, a refusal to be swayed by personal relations over doing justice, becomes the core plank of his kingship. So when Oldcastle, accused of heresy, says, sort of paraphrasing, "I'm mates with the king, what are you going to do?" The king says, "You will be judged according to the law." And so Oldcastle is, and he's condemned to die by burning as a heretic. But he escapes from the Tower of London somehow or other. The details of his escape are lost now. But he disappears into the Lollard underworld of London for 2 years, fermenting, very bitter towards Henry, as you can probably understand, fermenting sedition, fermenting plots, attempting to get in touch with all other haters of the Lancastrian regime that Henry represents. And he eventually comes to no good because he's run to ground in Wales. In fact, he's brought to ground by a sort of hunting a posse that go out to hunt for him, and a woman in the posse hits him in the shin with a milking stool, which would hurt if you think about it.
What a way to go!
So it's a sort of comically tragicomic end for Oldcastle, who's then brought to his final justice on a Lollard gallows, hanged and burned at the same time. So not a nice way to go. So this is an interesting story in itself. It's doubly interesting in this context because it casts light on Henry's development from prince to king, and his relationship both with his friends and with issues such as religion and issues such as justice.
And it shows so distinctly that even from an incredibly young age, because this isn't a spoiler, everyone, but all of this book happens when Henry is at a relatively young age.
Right.
So to watch him sort of figure out that core of his personality, and you do a great job at setting up, this is why. It doesn't just happen. He is from a young age primed to exist in this way, both as the performer, politician, watching Richard II and learning, and also watching his father, who has, pretty strong morals and sort of going down that path, even to the point of telling his own brother, if you betray me, you know what has to happen, essentially. And I think watching that aspect is really key and changed the way I look at sort of the monarchy of this time.
Well, yes. I mean, so I've talked a little bit about Henry's shape in Shakespeare, from Prince Hal to King. And Shakespeare, although he takes great dramatic liberties with Henry's life, as I've already suggested, in the Prince Hal phase most of all. I mean, not that he pretends not to do this. He tells you at the end of Henry V, the chorus walks onto stage in the epilogue and says, we've mangled by turns the full course of their glory. I've screwed around with history. That's like, I'm allowed to do it. I'm a dramatist. That's Shakespeare. When you take the real history, I think it's still important, or Shakespeare was onto the right shape for Henry's story, which was to give equal weight in his drama, spread across 3 plays, to the prince and the king. Henry was 26 when he became king. He was 35 when he died. So for most of his life, he wasn't king. And if you want to understand him in the round as a ruler, as a leader, as this case study of leadership in a time of crisis, you need to know how he came to be the person he was at the age of 26 when he assumed power. What's his hinterland? What's his backstory? What's his origin story? What's the Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins here? Because, and we are in our current age of storytelling, origin stories are still a big deal for us, right? And although that isn't a key decision-making factor in the way I wanted to write this biography, I was convinced that this has to be at least 50% Prince King, and that's the way the book is subdivided. It's almost exactly at the 50% mark, halfway through the book, that he's crowned. I mean, most biographies of Henry that I've ever read, which is, I think, all of them, he's generally king by chapter 2. Well, you're skipping a quarter of a century of his life, and you're skipping in some ways the most important bit, which is how do you make somebody who's going to be such a success? Where does it all come from?
And I think going through that time and getting to really understand him shows a different aspect, and it shows research that I think, even as I was doing my own research to talk about this book today, there is, like you said, not a ton of information out there about his early life. And I know that this book was a long process for you in the research and the creating. It took, some years to create. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how that came to be and how, by the time that you were finishing and writing this, and were there any surprises as you were coming to the end of your research?
It's been a long time coming, in the sense I've been thinking. I mean, in many ways, I started looking at this stuff in 1999. That's when I started as an undergraduate, started studying the Plantagenet dynasty and started thinking in conceptual terms about kingship, about what good kingship, bad kingship, successful kingship, unsuccessful kingship consisted in. So the sort of thinking bit of the book, which is in many ways the most important bit, has been like a quarter of a century. The active research bit is about 3 years, and the writing process, by the time I'd got my head around the whole thing, was relatively quick. It's like 5 months. I get into like a zone, usually over the winter, when I'm just, writing. But the research, I think, I was, as I've sort of, I suppose, hinted at already, I was most interested in the making of the king, the apprenticeship bit. And because Henry was not born to be king, he was born in 1386 when it looked like Richard II was going to have children of his own, and that would be the line the throne went in, and before his father had even begun to contemplate usurping the throne. And there's only scraps for his childhood, but there are enough scraps that you can hang, I think, solid arguments for a historical biography on. So the sources that I found really interesting and really changed my perception of who this warrior king was were to do with his mother's household in Peterborough when he was a child. This household I've alluded to already, of music, of books, of literature, of sort of piety and art and words and sounds all blended together. You trace that through to the toughest years of his campaigns, And you see, siege after siege in France, these horrible, diseased, endless, grinding, dusty, smelly, dirty, painful, bloody sieges. And Henry's always taking a pile of books with him, and harps, and new strings for the harps, and musicians, and all of this sort of this artistic hinterland, which you can see created under his mother in this house when he's a little tiny boy, is still with him if you look hard enough, when he's this really tough, hardened, in many ways, almost cauterized and desiccated warrior. He still has this imaginative hinterland. And that's not just important for sort of trying to round out the character. It also really matters, because on it hinges an argument about what he might have done if he'd lived longer. Henry died at 35, very abruptly, in 1422, while he was still sort of at war with the Dauphin, trying to complete his conquest of France. And you think, what was the end goal of this? And you can tell, once you've got these ideas about his reading and about his literary hinterland into place. At the time that Henry died, on that campaign, he'd taken books including a history of the First Crusade. He'd also commissioned a writer called Gilbert Lanoy to go to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Cyprus, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, as we call these places today, to chart the coast, to do diplomatic outreach, to start going, okay, how do we launch a new crusade? That, I think, is the missing third act of Henry's life, because he died before he could do it. On his deathbed, he says, had I lived, I would have rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. I would have reconquered it. We're still in a crusading era, nominally, to an extent. All medieval kings say exactly the same thing on their deathbeds. Oh, I would have gone to Jerusalem, dang it, is that the time, sort of thing. But I think Henry's serious, and you can know that, or you can know it. You can speculate that with a degree of rigour and certainty if you have in mind this idea of him not only as a fighter but as a reader.
I think if anyone was going to make it to Jerusalem, it would have been Henry. Who knows what would have happened there, but I do think if anyone had the determination from what I saw of it.
Well, it's probably, it's an interesting counterfactual. In 1417, and this is an area that it's not that well known or documented, in the late 14th, early 15th century, there's a great papal schism. And so you have, firstly, 2 popes in Avignon and Rome, and then you end up with 3 popes, because there's a third one in Pisa. And the Council of Constance in 1417 manages to put it all back together, and one pope is, 3 popes are deposed, and one pope is
one
elected.
Pope to rule them all,
one
would you say?
So Christendom Western Christendom is, at least nominally, reunited. Henry looks like he's moving through victory to a settlement in the 100 Years' War, which would, although it's not exactly a peaceable, amicable settlement with the French, it is at least looks like he's going to bring to a halt this long-running, damaging dispute between French and English. Those circumstances are, at least in outline, propitious for the idea of a new crusade. And you're right, if anybody has the experience, the determination, the nous, the kind of manic intensity to do it, it is this man, Henry V.
Would you say, if there are many people here who are going to be, I assume, going home and reading this book immediately, would you have a great fact to lure them in?
Well, the story that I start the book with is in many ways my favourite, because firstly, it's pivotal in Henry's life, and secondly, it's astonishing in terms of what you might think the Middle Ages is all about. Henry V only fights 2 battles. There's Agincourt, which I know about, and there's Shrewsbury in 1403, when he's 16 years old. And there's a rebellion of the Percys in the north of England, and they bring an army trying to depose Henry IV. And Henry V, the young prince at that time, commands the rear guard, the third of the 3 divisions of the Royal Army in that battle. During the battle, at some point, his father wins the battle, but during the battle, Henry either removes his helmet or lifts the visor and is shot in the face with an arrow shot from a longbow, which goes into his face, through his cheek, shears through the muscle, and the arrowhead lodges to the depth of 6 inches, says the surgeon's notes, in the back of his skull.
I had to take a little pause after I read that the first time, just to
You take
really...
a little pause if you're shot in the face with a longbow, I tell you. But
Yes.
Henry supposedly continues to fight. At some point, he or someone else pulls the arrow shaft, which comes away, and leaves the arrowhead. I'm so sorry. Leaves someone for the benefit of the podcast listeners is looking a little queasy in the front row. The arrowhead is lodged in the back of his skull. He's taken from the battlefield, and now this is a big problem. If anybody here happens to be shot with an arrow, shot from a longbow, go to the emergency room immediately. If that is not possible, it's a fleshy part of then push it out the other side. Well, you can't do that in your head. So they have to take this arrowhead out the way it went in, which is through the entry wound. So a surgeon is called for, a surgeon called John Bradmore, who is retained by the king. Henry IV is the great surgeon of his day, and his case notes on this and other operations he carried out still survive. Bradmore had saved the life of a carpenter who had slipped with a chisel and opened an artery. He'd cauterized the wound and saved his life. Bradmore had saved Henry IV's master of pavilions, who had attempted suicide by running into a wall holding a dagger to his guts. Bradmore had sewed up his intestines and not given him blood poisoning. Not easy in the early 15th century. Bradmore had done what we would now call plastic surgery, blepioplasty. He'd done eyelid bags and had concocted some cream, the Charlotte Tilbury magic cream of his day, which obviously sort of helped with the healing. Bradmore is the man, but even by his standards, this is a difficult operation. So what they do, I'm just going to have to tell you, is they, by degrees, open the wound in Henry's face, putting little sort of material plugs in and keeping it clean. It's the Middle Ages, but they're not stupid. They might not know the theory of germs, but they do know if you use alcohol, wine, and honey, you're less likely to get an infection of a wound. So they keep the wound clean, and they open by degrees. And then Bradmore, who as a good surgeon also has a line in blacksmithery, designs a tool which can clamp onto the arrowhead that's in Henry's skull and draw it out by degrees. And he successfully does that while keeping Henry's neck and head warm and avoiding him going into spasm and toxic shock. He then closes the wound up, sews it up, and I think may not leave much of a scar. So there's all this stuff about Henry's portrait is painted in profile because he was scarred down one side of his face. It might be for the birds. This is a guy who could do, as I've said, eyelid bags. Might not have had a scar. No one ever says, "Oh, Henry V, Victor of Agincourt, old Scarface." No one calls him that. Anyway, that's by the by. This operation, many people in this room look appalled at the mere description. This operation took 30 days. So this is a 16-year-old who puts up with the pain, the boredom, the presumable terror of, or consternation at the very least, of hovering between life and death for a month. He puts up with it, he survives. This is an extraordinary feat of medieval medicine, yes. It's also an extraordinary incident in the life of the subject of my biography. Because although it can only ever be speculative and judged from Henry's later behaviour, what would that do to a 16-year-old? This idea that not only the sort of the trauma of the experience, but in this world of the early 15th century, what does it mean to survive? It's literally miraculous. It must imply, mustn't it, that God has saved him for a reason. God wants him on earth to do something. What is that something? That seems to be the question that Henry wrestles with in the immediate aftermath of his injury and then decides upon by the time he's king. It's to seek justice. And in his mind, that justice is to be sought in France by taking back the things that have been unjustly removed from his family. Normandy, all this French land, and the crown of France, the ultimate prize of the 100 Years' War. And if you want to understand the almost manic determination, the laser-guided focus that this guy has, you can trace it back, I believe, but it's only my belief. I stress, he never writes this down, but I think it's plausible, it's likely. You can trace it back to this moment in 1403 when he's 16 years old and God appears to save him.
And if that doesn't make you want to read the book, I don't know what
give up.
will.
I give up, honestly.
But I have to round us out with one more thing. As we are booksellers, and as you are a novelist as well, I'd love to hear about some of your literary influences. Who do you read, both fiction, nonfiction, whatever? Who's the reader for you?
I read a sort of a peculiar and eclectic range of stuff. I've in my pocket of this jacket at the moment, I have The Spy Who Loved Me by Ian Fleming, because a friend of mine said she just read the audiobook and she said it was very good. We've been discussing the works of niche Scandinavian logorrhea sufferer Karl Ove Knausgaard, who's my strong... You laugh, but when you've read about a million words of him, I think he's brilliant. I mean, I don't know why. I'm not going to sell it to you now because it won't make any sense. I try and keep up with the A.K. Blakemore, Tessa Moshfegh, kind of that sort of side of literature, because my teenage daughter particularly likes it, and I like to read the stuff that she's reading as well. With regard to the fiction, that I write medieval fiction set in the earlier bit of the 100 Years' War. The original sort of stuff that got me going with that was my favourite my favourite historical novelist, weirdly, is James Ellroy. So like American Tabloid, Cold 6000, Blood's a Rover, that American Underworld trilogy really got inside my head when I was in my late 20s, and that sense of, the sort of sleaze, the underbelly, the bagmen, the roughnecks, working just one layer below the real historical characters. That really fired my imagination. Putting aside all the rest of the things I was captivated by in Ellroy's writing at that time. I love a Lee Child. Who doesn't? I read all sort of a really weird and wonderful mix, and that's I just follow my nose really.
I think that makes sense, and I think that readers of an eclectic thing will also enjoy Henry V, because there's a little bit of something for everyone. There is, of course, the incredible history, there is drama, there is intrigue, there are wild and crazy characters, and there is an arrow to the face. There's some descriptions of some crazy things, and I think you're all really going to love the man that is Henry V. So Dan Jones, thank you so much for joining us today on Poured Over.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.